Tonight on the season premiere of Nation to Nation, Missing but Never Forgotten. A vigil on Parliament Hill to remind people of families' anguish.
Because I know she wants to come home. And the hell that we lived through, I wouldn't want that for any of you.
Quebec's premier says talk of a government-to-government relationship is not covered by the Constitution. Our political panel responds.
Yesterday, the Prime Minister again, showboating, talks about nation to nation, when really nobody knows what it's all about.
Hello, I'm Todd Lamirande. Yesterday, Sisters in Spirit held their annual vigil on Parliament Hill. Talk swirled around the national inquiry on murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, how the commissioners should resign, and whether it needs a hard reset.
Survivors have lost all faith in the national inquiry and need you, Prime Minister Trudeau, to listen to us today and to work with us to rebuild a relationship.
Prime Minister Trudeau restated his support of the inquiry, but made no major announcements, such as extending its mandate. Laurie Odjick's daughter, Maisy, has been missing since 2008. She's on the inquiry's family advisory circle and has her concerns.
But I do not believe that for myself, I'm speaking for myself, that a reset would do any good, because no matter who sat in your chairs, there'll always be something wrong.
And joining me now is Laurie Odjick and her son, Damon Jocko. Thanks for coming here.
Thanks for having us.
Now, yesterday you were at the vigil, the Sisters in Spirit vigil, and you felt the need to defend the inquiry. Why did you feel you had to do that?
I think it was more, to give a different perspective, because there is a lot of families out there who want a hard reset. But from myself individually, speaking as a family member and not as a family advisory committee, because I also sit on that for the commission. But for me, it's no matter who sits on the commission, there's always going to be something wrong with who's sitting there. Not everybody's going to agree who is sitting there, representing our families. And that needed to be said, and it needed to be heard, because there's just going to be more time. And I myself, blamed the people who put this into place as setting us up for failure. And I believe that's what they did. They only gave us they gave them 2 years for families all across Canada. And 2 years is not long enough. And the commissioners, they're human. Mistakes are going to be made. Nobody's perfect. But I think, if we stand as one, as Anishinaabe people, and help support this inquiry, and maybe something will happen. I mean, it's a divide and conquer.
So you're not concerned about what some people are saying, a lot of disarray, especially over the summer, a lot of staff members left.
No, because
one of the commissioners actually resigned.
Yes. And I think that was a lot, everybody has their own decisions and to make as to if they're leaving or they're coming, and that things happen. As families, we know things happen. And to blame that on the inquiry, people are going to say what they want to say. But I would just like to see this work out with the commission.
You talked a bit about, you mentioned lateral violence during your speech. What did you mean by that?
Well, you know what, because, there's a division of families too, ones who wanting a hard reset and ones who don't. So the ones who, like me, who are supporting the commissioners, I'm not fully supporting them. I speak my mind when I have to, because I don't like the way things are handled. But for me, it's the government's fault, because there's red tape that they have to go through, whether they're applying for funding or, accessing money. It takes them a month to just approve that funding to do something. So
it sounds like you support the inquiry, but there is room for improvement.
There is room for improvement, but myself, I was always on the fence with the inquiry. What are we going to get out of this as families? Because everybody's expecting something different. We all want justice for our families, but there's some things that the national inquiry just won't be able to do that some families want. And that's where the letdown is going to be for these families, and that's where the trauma is going to set in for the families, because they're not going to get what they want out of this inquiry. And I know that, and everybody, I think, knows that.
You said you were on the fence. What was it that made you go onto one side of the fence?
I'm still on the fence.
Oh, you're still on the fence.
I'm still on the fence. I support, because I support the commissioners, because I don't think anybody else could do a better job. You know, like I just said a while ago, everybody's going to have something wrong, whoever sits there. And it's just going to be a constant battle as to who is sitting there.
Now, you talked about the 2 years, not enough time for the inquiry. What else could the federal politicians be doing to help this inquiry?
Help us get more time, you know, support the commissioners and the families. You know, it's supposed to be a family-led, families first. And it didn't start off that way, you know. And I think that's where a lot of, you know, backlash came, because families were not involved. And even with the Family Advisory Commission, that only came months later when they finally asked us to help, and we're families across Canada. And even the families that are sitting on the advisory committee don't agree with the commissioners, you know, but I think that's what they want. They want both sides. They want to feel the both sides of, you know, what we're seeing or what we're hearing. And I think a lot of some of that failure comes from lack of education. Education as to what an inquiry entails, what might come out of this inquiry, what's not going to happen with this inquiry. And there wasn't any of that in the beginning.
Of course, there were a lot of politicians there making speeches today, including the Prime Minister himself. Yes. What did you think of his speech? Were you expecting a big announcement from him?
Not really, because it's almost the same speech every year. I'm not going to lie. He's always saying it's hard. We stand with you. Well, you know what? I think it's about time you do something. You know what these families are asking for. You know, we need more time. And that's a big thing. More time and probably more money. And I think it's time for him to step up to his word that he wants to help these families instead of sitting in the background pointing fingers at somebody else.
I noticed you brought some moral support with you today. Who is here with you?
This is my son, Damon.
Hi, nice to be here.
Nice to meet you, Damon. What did you think of today's event? And you've told me off camera that you've been to several. So what do you think about these vigils?
Well, as opposed to the ones that we usually have on our own community, I think it was very emotional, and it was very interesting to see that all the politicians and having Prime Minister Trudeau there, and just everyone that was, you know, showing their support, because it's been so long for our family, just going through all this, to the vigils and press conferences and court proceedings, and it was really humbling and really powerful to see my mom up there speaking in front of everybody and really making a difference. And I noticed that with a lot of other media, just the attention that she got and the interviews that were given to her. Just it's for me, I never really been much of an advocate just towards missing and murdered, but I do like to stand and support my mom whenever I can. And it was very, very humbling, and it's a hard experience, but I got through it.
Well, I imagine it's been a hard experience for most of your life. Your sister's been missing for quite some time. Do you feel you're becoming more of an advocate and more aware of the issues as you get older?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, I like to keep, you know, whether it just be on social media, or I would like to keep, you know, the people that I know updated, and just let them know that, you know, it's not something to be forgotten, because, you know, if it were anybody else's loved one, it would be just as important as it is to us. So I like to, you know, I am becoming more of an advocate and supporting my mom and letting my voice be heard as well, because, you know, my mom is very powerful, and she, you know, she knows what she's talking about, and I respect and love her dearly.
I noticed you, of course, have the matching T-shirts.
Yes.
How else do you guys remember your daughter, your sister, in your daily lives, I guess?
In our daily lives, we celebrate our normal holidays that we used to: Christmas, Thanksgiving, any other day of the week. You know, we would just reminisce, you know, talk stories, and tell other people about, you know, not just the bad times that we have of her being missing, but the good times that we've had of her when she was with us, you know, and those are the moments that are really significant to us because that's how we know her, you know, that we love her, and she's my sister, and you know, my mom raised her to be independent and strong, and you know, that's how we want to remember her, not just as, you know, another missing person.
We're almost out of time, but I wanted to see if I couldn't. Is there any update about your daughter's case?
No, unfortunately, no, there hasn't been for a very long time. I mean, they get tips here and there, but they don't pan out. But it makes me happy to know that they're still looking and they're still vigilant about that.
And what do you think this inquiry can do for you about that, about her case?
I know it's not going to do anything for her case, but I'm hoping it's going to be able to help other families who are going through this nightmare. I'm always an advocate for frontline services for families, because as families, when our loved ones go missing, there's nothing. There's no services for us to turn to or to go to, and that's what I'm pushing for. I want help out there for other people who might go through this process.
Okay, that's it. We're all out of time. I want to thank you, Laurie and Damon. Thank you for doing this.
And thank you for having us.
When we return, our political panel is back, and we talk about Nation to Nation. Two days ago, Indigenous leaders met with the Prime Minister and Canada's premiers. Assembly of First Nations Regional Chief Isidore Day was upset with Quebec Premier Philippe Couillard, suggesting Couillard would not deal with Indigenous issues unless the Constitution was reopened. Later that day, the Quebec Premier clarified what he meant.
He talks about government-to-government relations. Of course, the Constitution only recognizes two orders of government, provincial and federal. So what we are saying is that if we want to have this type of recognition for First Nations, at first glance, it seems to be a constitutional process that is needed. And we've been very clear many times that Quebec will not participate in any constitutional conversation unless its demands are also on the table.
And coming back for another season of Nation to Nation and for the political panel is Yvonne Jones, Deputy Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations. Newbie, a man in the middle here today, is Kevin Waugh, and you're the Deputy Shadow Minister for Indigenous Relations. And Rachel Blaney from the NDP, Critic for Seniors and Deputy Critic for Infrastructure and Communities. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. So is the Quebec Premier right? How can there be a government-to-government relationship without it being spelled out in Section 35 of the Constitution?
I think that as we move through this new process of reconciliation with Indigenous people in Canada, there's going to be many questions that are posed like this, many challenges made in terms of what the role can be under current laws and constitutional agreements. But I think that's to be expected as well. We're really charting a new course. It's not precedented in terms of how our governments in Canada have proceeded. So yes, we would expect there's going to be questions like those raised by the Premier of Quebec. It's going to be up to all of us as Canadians that as we move towards this process of reconciliation with Indigenous people to find out what the right mechanism is. Right now we have proceeded with nation to nation, Crown to Inuit, government to government tables with both Métis, Inuit and First Nations governments. We're continuing with that process of dialogue. It's a process where priorities are being identified and addressed by all parties. Whether that is required to be entrenched in a constitutional way, I guess are going to be decisions that will have to be reviewed and looked at as we move along in that process.
Why hasn't the Prime Minister come out and said something about this, addressed the issue directly with the Premier?
I think that's a question you might have to ask the Prime Minister, but my guess is the course and the priority that the Prime Minister has placed on our relationship with Indigenous people is one in which they will be at the table with him in full dialogue. It's one in which his government will work cooperatively in partnership with Indigenous governments across Canada. So that has not changed. Regardless of whether it needs to be constitutional amendments or not, that process led by him as a Prime Minister in Canada today is not changing. He has really put tremendous emphasis on the process of reconciliation. That can only happen if governments are viewed as being equal in decision making when it comes to lands and treaties of Indigenous people.
Mr. Waugh, your colleague Kathy McLeod said yesterday that this proves that there's inconsistencies in the Constitution. What did she mean by that?
Well, there is. I mean, I totally agree with Kathy. The Constitution only recognizes the two levels of governments, Canada and the provinces. And I do agree with the Quebec Premier. There is confusion up there. And he said so on Tuesday, and he's right, because this current government has said over and over again, and Yvonne just said it, that you can't define what a nation-to-nation is. So yesterday, the Prime Minister again, showboating, talks about nation-to-nation, when really nobody knows what it's all about. So I wish he would stop using that. Constitutionally, we all know it's between the Crown, Canada, and the provinces. And he's using these wordsmiths, and it's causing a lot of confusion out there, not only in Quebec, but I would say the rest of the country.
That seems a strange bedfellow. Conservatives in bed with the Liberal Premier of Quebec.
Well, he's right. I mean, he pointed it out Tuesday. He's confused. We all are confused because it's clearly in the Constitution it's Canada and the provinces. So we have a Prime Minister going around this country talking nation to nation, and we haven't defined what nation to nation is. Now, the Prime Minister says it's up to the Indigenous people to determine that, but it isn't in the Constitution. So why are you going around talking nation to nation when really it doesn't affect the provinces in the country?
Ms. Blaney, your colleague Romeo Saganash had similar sentiments. He said that he's uncertain what the Prime Minister means by nation to nation. Can you explain what he meant by that?
Well, I think that's an important conversation, but I want to point out that Section 35 is really clear about the inherent right of Indigenous people. And as far as I know, Indigenous people are all over this country. Therefore, there is an inherent right that's active right now. In terms of clarity, absolutely. I think a lot of Indigenous communities want to understand more fully what this actually means. And when you see some of the challenges that so many of those communities are facing and the inaction by the current government on those same issues, of course people are confused. Of course Indigenous people are saying we actually need to see action. We're tired of just hearing words.
Now, of course, in your province, there's a patchwork of self-governments. You can become a self-government through treaty, through becoming a municipality, just through an agreement with the federal government to get out of the Indian Act. Should the Constitution be reopened to maybe clarify this?
Well, I think it's an interesting conversation, and I think what has to happen is we need to have a table where Indigenous people are actually at the table to have this meaningful conversation. So right now, you know, we're hearing from the government, the Prime Minister wants a nation to nation, and he's going to be there. Well, where is he? You know, too many communities are struggling in profound ways. We're having too many communities with young people committing suicide, and we have some promises that this government has made that they're still not following through. You know, recently we're hearing in the House of Commons about cases where the government is taking young people to court over small issues and spending a lot of taxpayer money. So it really comes back to that. What is a nation to nation? If this is a respectful relationship, how is that going to happen? Where is the place that we're going to have that conversation? And there is so many layers because we have different communities all across Canada. So it has to be a meaningful conversation, and it shouldn't be just left to Indigenous people to figure this out. They need the resources to be part of that conversation. So if that's how it's going to happen, let's make sure they have the resources that they need to do the work.
Okay, Ms. Jones, I guess I'll get you to respond to Ms. Blaney. The NDP have been bringing this issue up. They've been bringing up the issue of residential school survivors who are being taken to court under the IAP process. Again, is that a nation-to-nation relationship?
So first of all, I think it's important to be very clear, and that is that the Prime Minister have engaged with the highest levels of Indigenous governance in Canada, again, so this week, and I wouldn't expect my colleagues to understand the dialogue that occurs at those tables. However, what I would also say to you is that the ongoing meetings between the Crown in Canada and Indigenous leaders is one in which they are finding their way through dealing with many of these crises that Indigenous people are faced in Canada. Don't forget that this is the first Prime Minister and the first government in 10 years to raise Indigenous people to the top of the list in terms of those who need to be fully inclusive in Canada. And that's exactly what we're doing. When you look at residential schools as one of those particular issues, we've made tremendous progress. Out of 38,000 applications, 97% of those have been resolved. Some are still going through the appeal process. Some may not qualify for that appeal process, and that will depend upon independent circumstances under the process that was in place for all 38,000 people. This is not a decision in which government would arbitrarily say, no, we're going to overturn this and do this or do that. There is a process that 38,000 people have went through, and there are people that are continuing to go through that process. When you look at things like truth and reconciliation, we have already addressed 75% of the recommendations that pertain to government and external to government as part of that process. We have launched the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women. We have continued to invest in Indigenous communities, in infrastructure, in healthcare, in housing. We have created new models within government to allow for that direct investment into their communities. We have signed an education agreement with 23 First Nations in Ontario, in which right now 9,000 affecting 9,000 people, where there will be nearly 2,000 students that will be educated under their own First Nations education system.
Okay, you're running out of time. I have to move. Yeah, Ms. Blaney, especially when Ms. Jones mentioned the murdered and missing Indigenous, I saw a reaction from you. What?
Well, absolutely, there's a reaction. You know, let's look at the facts here. So many people across this country, Indigenous women, have wanted their voices to be heard. The process has been extremely confusing. They have felt completely rejected, and they are crying out for real action. We have seen how many people have left the commission. This is something that we need to get on top of, and it's appalling. And you know, it's very easy to stand and say, here's all the things. And I just want to say, I represent over 20 Indigenous communities, and all of those communities are crying out for significant support. They're very clear about where they need that support, and they call me frequently and say, what does nation to nation really mean? Because we've seen no change. It is the same as it used to be.
We're almost out of time. Okay, you get the last word.
There's no question the missing and murdered women and children has gone off the rails. Marilyn Poitras from Saskatoon was one on the commission. She left in June. There's a lot of questions, I think, that came to the Senate, came to our committee in Parliament about the way this process is going. They want an extension. We don't know where that goes from now. They've asked for a 2-year extension already, meaning they've done little or no work.
Okay, that's it. We're all out of time. I want to thank you, all three of you, for joining me today. We'll be back after another short break. That's all the time we have tonight. Next week, there may be a settlement in the class action lawsuit involving 60 Scoop adoptees in Ontario. We'll look more closely at that on the next episode of Nation to Nation. I'm Todd Lamirande. Have a great evening.